Mas não ser tão ingrata, não esquece quem te amou. E em tua densa mata se perdeu e se encontrou.
The Quinta da Boa Vista building is located in São Cristóvão, a neighborhood in northern Rio. A long time ago, it was the residence of the Brazilian imperial family. Today, the building houses the National Museum, the oldest in Brazil, created in 1818 by Portugal's King Dom João VI, the only European monarch to set foot in the Americas in over 400 years. Author Laurentino Gomes, in his book 1808, which is about how the Portuguese crown fled Europe to escape an invasion by Napoleon and set up residence in Rio de Janeiro, called the National Museum one of the oddest he had ever seen. It housed indigenous artifacts, Egyptian mummies, stuffed birds, a dinosaur skeleton, and a meteorite. Its collection also included Luzia, the oldest skull ever found in the Americas. All of that may have been lost on Sunday, September the 2nd, when a massive fire destroyed estimated 90% of the museum's collection and nearly caused the building to collapse. It took firefighters more than 6 hours to control the flames, as the museum's fire detectors weren't working, fire hydrants didn't have enough water, and the museum couldn't afford a fire brigade. It's a week of mourning for Brazilians, and the third fire to destroy a museum in 5 years. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, and this is Explaining Brazil. To discuss the impacts of the fire on the museum's future and on Brazilian culture in general, I'm joined by Diogo Rodriguez in our São Paulo studio.
Hello.
And by the museum's deputy director, Luis Fernando Dias Duarte, who joins us from Rio de Janeiro. Luis, thanks for talking to us.
Here I am.
So, Luis, this is Diogo Rodriguez, and I wanted to know, to start, what do we know about the causes of the fire so far?
The immediate causes we don't know yet, because the work that's being done by the firemen has not finished. And we're not yet sure about the stability of the walls, and so I don't think any real inquire about the immediate cause may be conducted now. What we can say about causes in a general way is the fact that the basic cause is the lack of funds by the federal government for the maintenance of the National Museum. This has been happening for decades. But of course, it's a geometrically progressive system, and the building of the museum was severely lack in infrastructural investments. We had just been able to sign an agreement with the BNDES, the National Bank for Development, for a funding, a very considerable funding, for some of these structural interventions, which included a system for the prevention of fires. It's a sad, a very sad, ironic situation that the fire preceded the money that the result from this agreement.
And Luis, the museum had one of Latin America's biggest collections. What has been lost with this fire, not only for the museum, but for Brazilian culture as well?
Oh, it's an immense loss. It's an invaluable loss, because the National Museum was the first museum and the first scientific institution to be created in Brazil. It was just completing 200 years of existence. And so it housed archives and collections, scientific collections, and cultural and artistic material that had been accumulated for these 2 centuries. So these collections amounted really to the most complete portrait of Brazilian culture and Brazilian nature.
I wanted to ask you another thing. Besides being a museum, Museu Nacional also hosts several researchers and research departments. Well, what is the loss for them? Have they lost their offices, their work?
This is an important characteristic of the National Museum, that it was a museum, but it was a house of science, a house of life science. And of also of education, higher level education, graduate studies programs existed in the museum, operated at the museum, in the areas of social anthropology, botany, zoology, archaeology, geology, and linguistics. Active science was existed for all the areas, for all the specialties of the museum. We are 90 researchers who work in the museum, operating in covering all these areas that I mentioned in the beginning of the interview. The loss for these people is very different, because for people like me, who am a social anthropologist, I can work as we operate. We do not operate with material culture. We can proceed to our researches, our scientific work, independently of the collections and the museum in itself, the building of the museum. But for natural scientists, for biologists, entomologists, all these people, they simply can't work without their collections, without their laboratories, without the microscopes, the electronic microscopes that are essential for biology as it is practiced nowadays, molecular biology. And so it's devastating for the most part of these scientists and technicians, because these scientific personnel included these 90 researchers, but also many technicians, specialists in the more technical levels of the scientific work.
And Luis, it is already possible to know what exactly will happen with them?
Well, we are just beginning to reorganize our forces, of course. What was destroyed in the fire was the palace, which was the main siege, the main part of the museum. But some areas were preserved. There was a building next to the palace, which was half underground, that has been not touched by the flames. And we had some buildings in the Arboretum, the Orto Botânico, that is part of the museum. It's part of the park around the museum and part of the museum. And there we had, happily, we had moved to that area the main library, which is a very precious asset of the institution, so it was preserved, and the whole department of botany, the herbarium, the collection of the vegetal items, and the department of zoology of vertebrates. So these areas were preserved, and we are trying to relocate the work of the colleagues who lost everything in the palace in these areas. I was just participating in a meeting of the social anthropology group, in which I am a member, and we are organizing ourselves to see where we'll give our lectures, our seminars in the graduate program, where we'll have the space for the reconstruction of our library, because the social anthropology library was entirely lost, and it was a very precious item of the museum activities. It was the best, considered as the best social anthropology library in Brazil and probably in South America. And so we are planning how to reorganize ourselves. Each sector, each department, each area of studies is trying to see how to restructure in the face of this appalling catastrophe.
Luis, the blame game between authorities has already started, with different administrations blaming each other for the problem, and nobody actually taking into themselves to shoulder the blame. And now presidential candidates have already expressed how important it is to value and to preserve museums, but their programs did not include museum preservation before the tragedy. Do you fear how the matter is being appropriated by politicians?
Yes, this is a sad aspect of disasters everywhere, of course, but in Brazil particularly, with the very bad quality of our politicians. But there is no difference, in fact, between the people who have been in Brazilian government for at least the last 3 decades, and the candidates for the next government. No one seemed to be really interested in museums, in politics of protection of heritage, of cultural heritage, and also not on science and active science, and particularly in the preservation of scientific collections. This was a very specific item that did not raise any interest even from the institutions, the national institutions that were in charge of funding for science and technology. The National Council of the CNPq, the National Council of Science and Technology, was not very, very conscious of the importance of the preservation of collections, natural sciences collections.
Is it possible to think about the future in a situation like this? And if it is,
yes, of course.
What's next for the museum?
We have to think about. I'm sorry. We have to think about future. Otherwise, we'll get mad with the force of this catastrophe. We are planning what to do, of course, at all levels. I think the main targets for our next activities are to renegotiate with the National Bank of Development for a different utilization of the funding that was already approved, and perhaps even for a reinforcement of this funding. The Minister of Education promised to release some emergency help, financial help, for the preservation of the ruins, so that the walls may not fall apart, and so that we can envisage for the future the reconstruction of the palace in itself. But more urgent for us now is the possibility of getting another piece of land near the park to build there a very simple, basic basis for the restructuring of our activities. This is the main target now, and of course some extra funding for the reorganization of laboratories and classrooms and all the paraphernalia, all the items that constitute the life of an educational and scientific institution.
Luis, this is the third fire, treat, or destroy or damage a Brazilian museum since 2013. We had the Latin American Memorial, the Portuguese Language Museum, and now the National Museum. What does it say about how Brazil and its authorities regard culture and culture preservation here?
These dramatic losses had different causes, I think. The Museum of Portuguese Language was a private initiative with official or government funds, of course. Its administration was in the hands of the Fundação Roberto Marinho, which is a private institution that's very active and very efficient. So I think in that case, it was really probably a technical problem. But for the many other situations, including other recent fires within the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, because we have recently, in the last years, lost the chapel of a very beautiful and important building that belongs to the university, which was the first madhouse in Rio de Janeiro. It's a beautiful neoclassic building, and the chapel was destroyed perhaps some 7 or 8 years ago, and it has not been restored up to now. The last floors of one of the main buildings within the campus of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in the island of Fundão was ravaged too by a fire, and it has not been restored so far. So in these cases, including the Museu Nacional case, are due to lack of funds. It's very clear. And this is not, of course, a peculiarity of the Museu Nacional and of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. This is a problem with probably all government institutions dealing with culture, with heritage, and with science. This catastrophe may happen again with any other official government institution in the area of culture in Brazil.
And Luis, this week we learned that Brazil's students are underperforming according to the IDEB tests that measure the proficiency of the students in many areas. And do you see a link between this poor school performance, the illiteracy that we still have in Brazil, the functional illiteracy, and the lack of care we have for museums and culture?
Yes, I think this is a systemic problem. You are quite right, I think, because a population that has no basic information about what civilization is, what modernity is, what the value of memory and of science is, these people cannot respect and cannot become politicians in the future with a sense of the importance of education, culture, and science. This is a generalized situation, of course, and the quality of the basic the basic education in Brazil is getting worse. The worst aspect of the problem is the fact that it's getting worse. There is no intervention that has been able to transform the situation into a better condition.
Luis, we would like to thank you very much for finding time to talk to us. What happened Sunday is a loss for all Brazilians, but I can only begin to imagine for you who work there every day what is going through your mind. So thank you very much for joining us for this podcast.
You cannot imagine what I lost half of my life, but it's good to talk about it. Yes, thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much. If you like this podcast, please take a look at our website. It's Brazilian.report. Every day we have new content about Brazil's politics, economics, and society. We also have exclusive newsletter services if you want to be briefed on what's going on in Brazil before starting your day. Subscribe now to our free trial and enjoy all of our content for 14 days. It's really for free. You don't have to put any credit card information. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Our handle is @BrazilianReport. That's all for now. See you next week.